and globalized. We're recording now, and I'm here to present our first speaker. For this session, Professor Quito Swan is a scholar of Black internationalism and professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. Hailing from the island of Bermuda, his talk today will be drawn from his most recent book, Pacifica Black, Oceania, Anti-Colonialism and the African World, published by the New York University Press 2022. Very recent. Wonderful, and congratulations. Please, we would like to hear the first presentation by you. Do you have a PowerPoint you'd like to share, Professor Quito?
I'll probably show an image or two, but I'll get to that. It's not going to be my entire presentation. And then we're also having technical difficulties, so I'd rather keep it pretty as simple as possible. But thank you so much, Monika. I'm really excited to be here. I was asked to participate, relatively short notice. It's also 12:30 a.m.
Wow.
where I'm currently sitting. So if I drag a little bit, you know why. So unfortunately, I was not able to attend the earlier sessions, but I heard it was fantastic, and I do look forward to seeing the recordings on my own time. So
thank you for joining us so early.
Thanks for having me. So today I want to talk about I want to center my discussion on Vanuatu, and really around how the New Hebrides National Party embraced Black internationalism and Black liberation theology in its fight against British and French colonialism in the 1970s, 1960s. This process was largely driven by the party's leader and co-founder, Father Walter Linney, who trained as an Anglican minister in the Solomon Islands and Auckland, New Zealand in the 1960s. His own father was an advocate of indigenous spiritual traditions, and this influenced Linney's own approach and his appreciation for traditional custom, culture, epistemologies, and cosmologies from not only Vanuatu, but Oceania, the African world, and the global South. For someone from my background who has studied African spiritual systems and the transformation of African spiritual systems in the Americas, it's been really exciting to engage Oceania's indigenous spiritual systems, particularly around waterways, the environment, which I think, is really critical. And for me, when I think about the African diaspora and the Black world, it includes Oceania, particularly around this concept of a Black Pacific. The book Pacifica Black, and actually the book that I published before that, Paulu's Diaspora, which was about, also covered Black internationalism in Oceania, particularly in Papua New Guinea, Black power in Australia as well. It's, my framing wasn't specifically religion, but it's hard to escape the significance of religion when we think of Black internationalism in Oceania. And just one slight mention. Can everyone see the screen? This is the cover of Pacifica Black. Well, should be the cover. Pacifica Black, there we go. Paulu's Diaspora is the second book I mentioned. Usually when I talk about my work, I center Black international 1970s in Oceania with this album cover of Bob Marley's Survival, his 1978 album, which is a strong Pan-African manifesto. The cover was designed to have some 49 flags of Africa. But there's one flag on this album cover that is not of Africa. It's the flag of Papua New Guinea, which is striking, but also shows this is not just an album around music. This also is a conception of Rasta. And Rasta as a Pan-African spiritual system that is connected with Black theological systems, but also is a really anti-colonial movement. There's a consciousness of the Pacific, of Black freedom fighters in the Americas as well. A complicated conception, but for me, this kind of speaks to some of the routes of religion as a medium for some broad connections between Africa, Oceania, and the broader Africana world. But that being said, I'd love to talk about that further. But there's not so much the center point on my talk today. Black liberation theology, it's a term that's drawn from the work of African-American scholar and theologian James Cone, who in the era of the Black Power movement developed a revolutionary theological idea based upon a Black experience in the United States of oppression and also liberation struggles. For Cone, theology emerged from the experiences of his communities, which in turn define God. As such, if Western European theology served the oppressors, for Cone, Black liberation theology asserted and supported Black liberation. And as stated, I saw Black theology, or liberation theology, in Vanuatu's national struggle. Although the term Black liberation theology emerges in the 1960s, it's clear that this is not the beginning when Black people would create theologies based upon their own systems. This is just one of the framers around Black power. Also, while my comments will highlight how the ideas of Black, or we could say Melanesian liberation theology, were linked to anti-colonialism, I'm also intrigued by how religious networks, spaces, and print media also served as conduits for Black internationalism in Oceania. So if you just bear with me, I want to read just a little bit from one of my chapters in Pacifica Black, which is centered on Vanuatu. So in 1973, the Melanesian Council of Churches organized a 2-week South Pacific Action for Development Strategy Conference, also known as SPADES. Chaired by Reverend Sitiveni Ratuvili of Fiji, SPADES was held across New Hebrides, Fiji, and Samoa. The conference was attended by an array of political organizers from across PNG, Fiji, Cook Islands, Nauru, Tonga, Tahiti, New Caledonia, and New Zealand. This included Fiji's Claire Slater, who I'll talk about more, Walter Linney, and also a rural development officer from Tanzania, Apollonius Masha. Masha discussed African socialism and Tanzania's Arusha Declaration, which focused on Julius Nyerere, Prime Minister of Tanzania's African socialism, and his aim to push for self-reliance at the village level. So clearly, while this is a conference organized by the Melanesian Council of Churches, the discussion is not just about religion, it's also about politics, development, and self-determination. This is critical because Tanzania's ideas around self-reliance would also inform the New Hebrides National Party and Walter Linney's ideas for national development in Vanuatu. But it's striking that this space created by a religious institution also becomes a space for anti-colonialism. The conference discussed relationships between culture, development, and colonialism. For example, it was discussed that development could not occur without independence. One reverend from Western Samoa asserted that he had an obligation to his brother. I'm not completely free, but I know my brother's oppressed. Pacific Islanders must do away with colonialism to be full men. The conference also voted on a statement stated that all people under colonial governments in the Pacific were oppressed and exploited. Interestingly, Tahiti abstained from this vote. The statement condemned French nuclear testing in Oceania. Spades also pledged to take a militant stand against this by consulting with the World Council of Churches, the Pacific Conference of Churches, and also the Melanesian Council of Churches. It argued that education systems were in the hands of foreign imperial educators and not relevant to Pacific people. It pushed for the environment and the cultures of Oceania to not be exploited. The tourism needed to be controlled, that Pacific peoples needed political freedom, and that the church should review its place and its mission in society. Spades denounced colonialism in all of its forms, the education system. It pushed for the training of modern farmers and the use of indigenous languages and local syllabi, and the development of teachers who had agricultural backgrounds. The conference was attacked by the British residency in Vanuatu. Walter Linney, who also edited the New Hebrides National Party's newsletter, Viewpoints, pushed back against the state's attack. This would be a consistent theme where, British and French officials attacked Walter Linney for using the pulpit to address issues of anti-colonialism. But to use a cricket term, Linney tended to stick to the wicket. From these discussions, one critical idea was raised that there should be a conference or some type of religious meeting through the World Council of Churches should take place in Tanzania. This actually takes place in 1974 during a trip called Ujama Safari. Ironically, this also took place during the 6th Pan-African Congress of Tanzania, which is a critical moment for the Pan-African movement globally. Under the guise of attending the World Council of Churches meeting, leaders like Barack Sope, Mildred Sope, other leaders of the New Hebrides National Party covertly went to Tanzania, although the French government was well aware of their intentions and expressed concern with the parties, what they described as dangerous liaisons with Tanzania. At the 6th Pan-African Congress, Barack Sope presented the case of independence for Vanuatu to a major delegation of Black leaders from across the Americas, United States. He stood in for other liberation struggles in the region. In other words, he asked, when France was kicked out of Algeria, they took the nuclear testing to Oceania. When colonial officials were kicked out of Kenya, they were sent to the Pacific. And he called on Black governments, Black revolutionaries from the Black world to identify with these struggles. And he argued that people from Vanuatu, Melanesian, Oceania had sailed from Africa, from a different part of a broader Black world, and needed to be considered as such. For me, this was really, really striking. Once again, I didn't necessarily write the book from the perspective of religion, but it was quite striking and quite intriguing to see that time after time, Pacific leaders from Vanuatu used these religious spaces to organize politically against colonialism. The Pacific Council of Churches, who organized the trip to Tanzania, later released a special edition of its Risk magazine in 1976 called Song of the Pacific. This was to coincide with a major meeting in Papua New Guinea. The theme of the assembly was God's mission and the change in Pacific society. But in the introduction to Risk magazine, Rex Davis of the PCC described Oceania's political and cultural struggles around anti-colonialism, the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement, decolonization in Papua New Guinea. He described how the issue was haunted by a melancholy mixture of rage and resignation. There were harsh words uttered against colonialism in all its manifestations. And these movements in Oceania needed to be taken seriously, even if the region represented a small parcel, quote, of the third world. Davis had been introduced to the world of Melanesia at the 1970 Wagani seminar in Papua New Guinea, which was a critical space of discourse on Melanesia. This issue of the Song of Pacific the content was compiled by Amelia Rokutavuna, Vanessa Griffin of Fiji, Marjorie Kukum, and also Ron Kukum, featured poets, short story writers, activists, scholars, and work drawn from Pacifica perspectives, magazines like Mana. It included contributions from PNG's John Momis, Samoa's Albert Wendt, the New Hebrides National Party's Mildred Sopé, and Southern Islander Francis Bogotu's Decolonizing and Recolonizing, which is from my opinion, one of the most critical essays on anti-colonialism and Black liberation theology. Song of Pacific called on advocates from North America to question the US involvement in Micronesia, advocates in Africa to call for an end to nuclear tests in Oceania, and France and the UK to address the New Hebrides question, and for allies in Australia and New Zealand to speak up about the economic hegemony of this country in Oceania. This also represented the church's concrete involvement in Pacific liberation struggles, at least through the discourses. In 1976, the World Council of Churches, through its program to combat racism, funded some $10,000 each to the New Hebrides National Party, Australia's FACATSI, and in 1984, for example, it gave grants ranging between $1,500 to $10,000, totaling $200,000 to 40 anti-racist groups across Australia, the Philippines, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, US, Canada, Japan as well. I would just say that during the Black Power movement, there was a ton of pressure put on the church, a ton of pressure put on the church by Black Power activists who called for reparations, who denounced the church's role in the slave trade. And in this moment, from my perspective, the World Council of Churches was a space where Black organizers and indigenous organizers from the world gathered to further the anti-colonial movements. Always a space of tension, but once again, those spaces really intrigue me as well. I'm sorry, Monika, how am I doing on time? I feel like I'm up against it.
So it's typically spoken for 20 minutes. How are you going? Do you want it to wrap up soon?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit. I couldn't hear you. My apologies.
Yeah. Sorry about the Zoom. So you've been speaking for about 20 minutes?
Oh, no, I'll wrap up.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. I think I might be hanging. Can you still all hear me? I think my video has frozen there. All good still. Okay, thank you so much. So what I would like to do is, if we can hold the questions until after the second speaker. So the two speakers for the second paper, then we could have a good, I think, dialogue. Yeah, so we can see the links between the two papers so that people can have more questions. Would that be fine for all the speakers, that we will have the questions after? Yep. Thank you, Professor Quito. Thank you for a great presentation. So I will now introduce the co-presenters and the second paper. So the presenters are Dr. Duncan Wright, an associate professor and head of archaeology at the Australian National University School of Archaeology and Anthropology. Welcome. Being an alumni myself from anthropology at ANU, I'm very excited to hear your presentation. And Dr. Duncan Wright research adopts a partnership approach, collaborating with First Nation communities who seek present-day cultural and economic outcomes using archaeological and ethnographic study. Wonderful. Currently, he has active projects in Eastern Torres Strait, Central Queensland, and Slovakia. And his co-author today is Rod Mitchell. You can see him joining us already. Hi, Rod. Rod's main career has been in EFL and ESL and other language teaching, language teacher training, and language school academic management in England, Australia, France, Timor-Leste, and Italy, where he now lives, where he's joining us from. A speaker of Yumplatok, Torres Strait Creole, and Kalau Lagaoya, Western and Central Torres Strait. Since childhood, he has a background in linguistics, descriptive, analytical, applied, cognitive linguistics, language teaching and learning, socio-anthropological, historical, and comparative. Welcome. Please introduce your paper. I might have to leave and come back because I'm frozen, but please go ahead. You have a PowerPoint? Wonderful.
Got a PowerPoint, yep.
Yes, I can see that.
All right, so it's going to be interesting to try and make connections with the previous very interesting paper, because I think this is very, very different, but we will see. Okay, so in this paper, we're going to be exploring transnational religious flows in the Pacific Ocean. We're particularly interested at looking at this from a historical perspective, both cultural, linguistic, and archaeological, and looking in the region of the Coral Sea and the Arafura Sea. So that's basically the zone between southern Papua New Guinea, Torres Strait Islands, and Cape York in mainland Australia. And we're doing this because we feel that this is an absolutely fascinating area in terms of extremely diverse and very, very interesting and culturally different areas between Melanesian communities in New Guinea and primarily hunter-gatherer communities, although I know there's a lot of debate about that in Cape York. We're also doing this because we were approached by the community to do it. So the Gumulgal of Mobiag and the Miriam on Murray Island, they have been looking into an ancestor trackway that spans this area. What we're going to do is attempt to go beyond the discussions that often plague archaeological literature and linguistic literature. And these tend to be to do with these wholesale movements of people. We also think about genetic flows and stuff like that. We don't really think about the human actors. We don't think about the spiritual sides of it. The other thing that we don't do, and this is very obvious to Torres Strait Islanders, is we don't look at it in ways that are meaningful for them. So they also think about cultural flows and religious flows across this region, but they see this, of course, in terms of ancestor pathways and totemic geographies. They see it in terms of the movements of cultural heroes that span this entire area. One thing that hopefully will come up in this paper is that when we look at European inscribed boundaries, including things like I just said about Melanesia, Torres Strait, Papua New Guinea, these are very much not the boundaries that are seen by Torres Strait Islanders today. There are huge amounts of links that span these areas based on marriage ties, based on cultural affiliations, and as we will find out, based on the trackways of these important culture heroes. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a Morecambe and Wise act here, I think. So we're going to be skipping between myself and Rod. So I'll hand over to Rod here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so we are looking here at an area where, on the one hand, indigenous peoples in Papua New Guinea and to some extent in Australia have managed to keep a lot of traditional knowledge, law, and even religious beliefs, despite Christianization and colonization. Unfortunately, in Cape York, it has been very different. So looking at the we are looking here at a cultural area which has up to 9 completely different language groups. There, however, throughout this area, there seems to be a general cultural structure, social structure, with 2 moieties generally based on winds, northwest, southeast winds, and the other moiety on the northeast, southwest winds, and their associated subclans. Every clan, it seems to be standard everywhere, has a main totem. Algad is a totem god, various sub-Algad, and also a Zugub. A Zugub is a sky god, and a Zugub star, the star that is a constellation that is associated with the Zugub sky god and its wind. And within this totemic thing, there is an integrated culture hero cults, which seem to be much more modernizing within the last 1,000 years, and godlike cosmology that has many similarities to Vanuatu, Polynesian, Lapita type cosmology. I have put a list of very important beings. So the Algad is the totem god, Zugub is a sky dog, Dogai is a witch woman who has very significance with agriculture and so on. Madub is the spirit that is the messenger of the sky god, like an angel in Christian belief, and then the Mabwa, Imagar, a type of Madub. Then there's the Muri, which is the rain spirit. Then there are important people, which brings us close to what our topic, which is the Adi, is the great culture hero who brings knowledge and spreads knowledge and so on. Then there is the Muruig. The Muruig is the person who is the person, mythical person who started the clan. Okay. The Muruig is linked to the totem, the Algad, and the Adi is linked to both. Then we have the Markai. The Markai are the ancestors. When we die, our spirit, the Mari, through a certain series of steps in which we are going to talk about today, to go to the afterlife, which is the sky world, which is beyond the horizon and beyond the sky all around the world. So on the other side of the sky is Kibukut, the heaven. And in this heaven, each totem has its land, and this land, this totemic land in heaven, let us say, is linked to the totem land on throughout this southern Papuan area, Torres Strait and Cape York. What this means is that all the peoples of the area, through this linking, cross-cultural linking of their totems and their clans, have a network of trading, intermarriage, and so on throughout the area, despite having vastly different languages. Then Eastern Torres Strait, which is Mariam, near. So Western Central Torres Strait, there's a lot more going on. Eastern Torres Strait, the Mariam, there are fewer terms, but the system is much the same. Agud is the totem god, the sky god. Puleb is a female protector, lots of different female protectors of horticulture and so on. The Madub are the spirits which bring magic. The Ad is the cultural hero, and the Lamar is the ancestral spirit. The general concept from religion is that the ancestral spirits take very deep interest in their lives and happenings of their descendants, and so a lot of respect is paid to the Makai, to the Lamar, which is an important part of the religion. And this importance has stayed on despite Christianity. The core law is passed through in the Western and Central Torres Strait through Adi, which are the stories of the great culture heroes. The Gida, which are sort of seen as like historical narratives of certain culture heroes who move around spreading knowledge and information and creating links between different communities. Natai are the songs that are used to pass some of the law. Then there are the dances, the girel, and the dances themselves add to the law. And the Kaaba are the dancing and song sequences that in various dances and songs, there is a build-up of the overall story of the law. And then all these include aspects of Sabi, which is law, and Maid, which is magic science. In the Eastern Torres Strait, similar words, similar concepts, and sometimes different words. Okay, I can move on. So, who are we looking at today? There are three sets of Adis, great cultural heroes, and Mudui, clan, well, group ancestors, cult ancestors in this case. Soida, Sida, Sida, Said, Sida, Soida, Hida. There are different names of this person according to local language and so on. Mainly across from an amazing distance, for an amazing distance in southern Papua, from the eastern end of the Gulf of Papua, all across over the border into Indonesia. What his role was, basically the spread of plant food through fertility rights and sexuality along the southern coast of Papua, over the border into what is now Indonesia and into Torres Strait itself. Going around through Torres Strait and then coming back. And then he is interested in that he had two lives. There was a death, a rebirth, and then another death. And then following his second death, he instigated the journey of the spirit through the different steps from Kiwai or wherever to a gateway point, which is Boidu in northwest Torres Strait, which is where the gateway, just after this is the gateway to heaven, to Kibukut. And he went through these steps. He then went to Adiri, which is the Kiwai for the other afterlife. And he prepared the afterlife with houses, gardens, and so on for the coming of the dead. The second pair is Alkam, the mother, and Ti, her son. Ti has no father. And Alkam's mother and father are not known. Now, Alkam is the woman in the moon. She now lives in the moon, and the moon god, took her into the moon. Ti, there was his death and the journey of his spirit from in Torres Strait, the different pathways that he took to Boigu, and his mother followed him. And then in this process, the story introduced the different steps, the different processes that need to be done for the good pathway of the spirit to the other world. And some of these customs have been Christianized. Okay, and then Naga and Wyatt, which was the two people who originally led Duncan to this story, who is the much recent, within the last 700 years, the basic concept of Wyatt and the celebrations which seem to bring together Said and Alkam and Ti, and then create a greater community-wide and also Torres Strait-wide linking of celebration in about October sometime, both when the Markai come back to escort the recently dead to Kibukut, but also to celebrate the role of the Zugu, the Dagai, in the yearly cycle of life. So the coming of the rains, the harvest, planting, everything, and linking all this together into the cycle of life of people. We go to Kibukut, but of course, in a later life, we come back to this world to become alive again. And then the cycle completes. And all of this is, as I was just saying, all of this is over the masters of ceremonies of this are the totem god and the sky god. Okay, finished there. Now, religious songs, coastal history. Okay, here, this is the Torres Strait area, southern Papua. We cannot see all of southern Papua, which are like a couple of 100 kilometers to the northeast and a couple of 100 kilometers to the west, covers the area. And then in Cape York, maybe a couple of 100 kilometers down is the Torres Strait cultural area. Torres Strait in this case, simply because Torres Strait is in middle. Here there are the various peoples from Papua. I start again. This area 8,000 years ago was dry land. And the peoples of this area, then when there was a transgression after the Ice Age, people were pushed north onto the islands and south. And this seems to have not changed very much. The people were still the descendants until the coming of the coming of the Papua New Guineans from further south in Australia and the Trans-New Guinea Island people from further north about 3,600 years ago. And then from these different inputs, because there is seems to have been continual contacts, intermarriage, intercultural influences, a system developed of which highlighted, improved, maximized the possibility of down the line trade. So from Cape York through Torres Strait to Papua and vice versa. Though most of the trade seemed to be from the north into Torres Strait for certain objects and other objects from Cape York, including the most important thing with maintaining this social networking of very different people who are often fighting each other and headhunting from each other was the imperative of creating a balance and a counterbalance and a reciprocity between different clans, different moieties, different communities and different peoples, which seem to have, by the time of colonization, seems to have reached a pretty good equilibrium and probably have been in existence in this equilibrium for some centuries, except for a few that were moving on. So there, as I said, it was very big, a lot of linguistic diversity. This area of Papua New Guinea, including the top of Cape York, this is one of the most diverse linguistic areas of Papua New Guinea, equal in diversity, perhaps more diverse than the Sepik region. These are the two with biggest diversity. So 9 language clades, so 9 language families which are completely unrelated to each other, plus there are 2 isolate languages. But thousands of years of contacts have created a lot of, so when you look at the words in these languages, compare cognates, loan words and so on, all languages have some varieties of mix with each other. So the core territory, so if you look at Torres Strait, the main language families are Yamaro, which is the northwest, Pahoturi, which is directly north from Boigu and Saibai, and then East Transfly is between Saibai and Daru, just up the Papuan coast, and then there is the Kiwayan group, which is Trans-New Guinea Island. It came down from the mountains about 3,600, 3,000 years ago into the Fly Delta. Paman at the same time, about 3,600, 2,000 years ago, managed to finally reached Cape York after they had started migrating south of the Gulf of Carpentaria around 7,000 years ago. Probably Yamaro, Pahoturi, East Transvaal, and other Paleo languages were in existence then. Yamaro, Pahoturi, and East Transvaal might be languages that are directly descended from the languages of the area before transgression. The Western Torres Strait language and to a lesser extent the Eastern Torres Strait language have lots of words, like 30% of words in the West, which have no known relationships elsewhere in Papua New Guinea, Australia, except with these languages in the immediate vicinity. So these seem to be words that are descended from that time. So there is some language evidence for Paleo language. Then Trans-New Guinea phylum people arrived from the highlands, the Pamans arrived from down south, and then the next major movement, which is when we come into a transnational religious flow within a Pacific sense, that people, Oceanic Lapita Austronesians, who had started from the Bismarck Archipelago and then started spreading east, but they also went south and they reached Port Moresby area by about 2,900 years ago. And they brought in Lapita pottery, but also culture, religious culture and so on. And they reached Torres Strait about 2,800 years ago, between that period and 2000. And so horticulture period appeared, canoe technology. There is a mixture in Torres Strait of old Austronesian canoe technology from the west, but then more recent from the east. The Western Torres Strait language in particular was heavily influenced by these Southeast Papuan incomers. So there are I have been researching this and come across already around 300 or so Eastern Austronesian words for horticulture, community, social life, and so on. Within the last 1,000 years, however, because of its position, because of canoe technology, because of having direct contact with direct sourcing of valuable seashells like armbands, oyster shells, and turtle, hawksbill turtle shell, and so on, the islanders seem to have, because of their intermediate point, become to have a dominant position in the area, and their religious culture started to influence both in Papua and in Cape York. And so there are sacred songs, for example, among the Kiwi in Papua New Guinea, in the Eastern Isles, Miriam, also in the Gisara people and others, which come from Torres Strait, cultural belief systems which also heavily influence the Papuan peoples, which in some cases appear to be an origin, Austronesian beliefs from the Lapita people. But also there were Papuan influences, for example, from the west, what we can see on the northwest of the map, from that area, there was a group of people, Bomai, the uncle, the maternal uncle, the teacher, and then Malo, Pinakar, Siai, Mayal, Kulka, and Sau. These, they were the brothers. They set out from there and they traveled by Boigo, then south across Torres Strait, visiting different places, all the way down to Kukuyapu people of the northeast coast of Cape York. And then they started coming back, and each brother settled on different islands from Nagi, which is in the middle of Torres Strait, more or less, about 50 kilometers north of Cape York, and then different brothers on different islands from Nagi all the way across to Mare. So linking through this cult, the Malubomai cult, people from Nagi, Warab, Yama, Tudu, and so on, Masi, Indamut, and so on. There were also other links between the different people, so like the different clans, so on Murray Island, despite what Haddad and others reported, it is clear that they had not understood that the traditional totemic system on Murray Island had been maintained, and that their focus on the cults had blinded in a way then to the undercurrent of the cults. And so the Murray Islanders and all peoples trade and so on, only with specific peoples in the other islands, which comes back to the totemic importance of the networking in the area. Then possibly around 600, 700 years ago, because of political decisions by the Dutch government in Indonesia, which banned things like the nutmeg trade and so on, people of Maluku region, they started traveling along directly to Papua New Guinea and along as far as Torres Strait, trading for different things like sandalwood, other types of trees, horse and tortoiseshell plate, and so on. And they probably visited Torres Strait in this period from about 600 years to about 1790s. And so there are some aspects of the traditional terms and so on in the area which suggest there could have been some Eastern Indonesian influences. And then in the 1870s came Christianization, and like everywhere else in the world where this happens, you could almost say that Christianity was integrated into traditional religion to varying extents. And so Christianity in Torres Strait, in Papua and so on, has a very, and elsewhere, of course, in Papua, has a very traditional indigenous undercurrent, which means a lot of, sorry, that's it, finish.
Okay, so basically what Rod's been talking about here I know there's a lot of information there, but basically what we're seeing is a huge amount of diversity, but at the same time we have this system at play that is personified in a way by these cultural heroes, that is all of these artificial interdependencies and these connections between different communities. So what can we get out of archaeology to look at these religious flows within the area? Well, there's been a bit of archaeological research in Western Torres Strait, and that's revealed, and the Central Islands now as well, that's revealed that there is a corpus of sites, so these dugong bone mounds and boo and stone arrangements that are spread across this region. So there's clearly a lot of intersections in at least the practice, ritual practice, if not belief. We know that these are also incorporated, so from the cultural knowledge, and I should stress that this is a paper that's actually with Signet Repu as well. He's providing some cultural backdrop too. These are very much totemic infused sites, so they're very, very important. We know that the age of these particular features is around, so 400 or 500 years ago, with some sites going up to about 800 years, but no more than that. What's really fascinating is this entanglement that Rod's talking about seems to go across a much larger area. So, for example, we have these remarkable dugong bone mounds that were formed in the Princess Charlotte Bay region on Cape York. We also have very intriguing links in terms of the Makai ceremony, so the funeral ceremonies that are going on in Torres Strait and in southern Papua New Guinea, and one area of Cape York as well, which we'll go into in some detail as well. But with all of this data, how are we possibly going to understand it? And this is where Rod and I think the Adi and Gida come in, because these basically humanize this story. But is it going to be possible to historicize these Gida? So similar to sagas that we might have heard about elsewhere in Icelandic contexts or whatever, these are not meant to be read as historical documents as such. So there's a whole bunch of, there's symbolic elements to this. However, at the same time, when you talk to Torres Strait Islanders, and we have done this across Torres Strait, they are very clear about the fact, and indeed this is playing out in native title, in land claims and things like that. It's recognized that there is a connection that spans all of these different areas. And this is imprinted in the art, it's imprinted in the stories, the songs, and it goes back for at least 180 years when the early anthropologists were recording this, but probably much, much longer. And even if we don't believe that we can read these stories as histories, we have to accept, and everyone has to accept, that there's elements of commemoration that go on that relate to these Gida, or these culture hero stories. Now, that spans everything from the artworks, but also the sites where initiations happen. So, for example, we have these culture heroes that brought ceremonies connected with the afterlife, and these important initiations, these transitions to manhood. So we can look at these particular cod sites, these particular initiation grounds, and find out whether there is an antiquity to this or not. So we're now going to do that, or attempt to do that. So Rod is going to tell the stories very briefly, I think, Rod, because we're going to go over time.
Very, very briefly, yes.
For Cedar, Wyatt, and Alcum.
Okay, so Cedar, how can we... Cedar, the stories of these peoples exist in different versions according to local peoples, and each version often is a single chapter with an overall storyline. The Cedar storyline is probably the most complex. He was born 2 times on Kiwai, and he died 2 times, obviously. And his travels took him from Kiwai, which is off the map to the north. We can't see Kiwai, all the way across to what is now around the Indonesian border. And some stories have him even going further than coming back and then traveling around Torres Strait. So he was born, his father, Sopuse, was a gardener on northern Kiwai, U'uwal, which is the northern part of Kuwai. And there he made gardens, he planted things, but he also, next to a pond, he made a hole in the ground, and he, as Haddon put it, copulated with the hole. And over time, and then after a while, this gave birth to cedar. So he was born from the ground. And then as he grew up, he learned about planting and so on from his father. And then he started traveling all the way across the southern coast of Papua and as far as close to the New Guinea border and the Indonesian border now. And then he came back to what is now the area of Buzi. Buzi,
Rod,
if you see
so,
the island
sorry
of
to interrupt.
Buzi.
Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt, Rod. We've only got 5 minutes, so we may need to.
Okay, so, and then he ended up going through, he would leave, what can I say here? He would leave different types of horticultural knowledge and so on at each island and each place in his travels according to the beauty or age of the woman that he was given. Murray Island gave him the best women and most women, particularly Pakari, and so this got all the great stuff. And then he went back to Kiwai. At Kiwai, he was killed due to a love by jealousy, because two people, a girl preferred him to another person, and so the other person killed him. And after that, he traveled west to establish Adiri. Alcam and Wyatt, Naga, from Nagi, the crocodile ancestor Wyatt, Naga traveled up into Papua, created all the rivers along the south coast of Papua, and then later he and Wyatt started traveling around. They ended up going to Daru, learning the Makai Tai ceremonies, which had been developed in Daru like 1,100 years ago, 700 years ago, about the time of the Little Ice Age. And then they spread these ceremonies, these death celebration ceremonies, community celebration ceremonies through Torres Strait, and they went as far as Kukuya'u territory in Cape York. Alcam and Ti, they're basically the easiest to tell because Ti died, as I said earlier, and he was killed by somebody. His spirit, not knowing it was dead, ended up in Boigu. His mother followed him. His mother told him he was dead. He then had the choice: go to the next afterlife, to the next world, or go back home. If he had gone back home, of course, there would be no death. He chose death. And so he and his mother, they disappeared into the ground on Boigu, which established the fact that for islanders, you must be buried in order to get to heaven. This is a very important thing. And so the grave ceremony is a Christianization of this. So in modern island society, there's a Kulubud Pudai, which is the tombstone opening. And this ceremony represents the fact that the person has been buried. When the grave is completely decorated, completely ready, then the spirit can leave and go to the totemic ancestor in heaven. And the totemic ancestor was made by God. So back to the totemic ancestor in heaven, therefore with God. And that's it. Very quick.
Do you want to wrap up, Duncan?
Sorry.
All right. Well, so maybe just a few very interesting trends that are coming out here. So we see that a number of these culture heroes, they have links that are going through language. So Wyatt, for example, he sets off from the Binneh region. This is East Transfly language, which is identical to the Miriam over here as well, and so on and so forth. Very quickly, I'm going to just mention the commemoration of this, so the archaeological patterns. There's been a number of excavations that have now happened at some of these cod sites along the way, and we've found very, very intriguing things. So, for example, we have Signet Repu, the co-author of this paper. He talked about right at the beginning that we're likely to find evidence for these initiations, the young boys getting stabbed with stingray spine spears and such like. We excavated this site. We found out that you have these dugong bone mounds, And inside these mounds, which date back 700 years or so, here we have the stingray spine spears, work stingray spines. We also have some very interesting patterns going on. So things that weren't remembered in the oral histories. We have layers that are filled with tiger shark teeth. It's an element of the Wyatt narrative that is maybe not in the stories today, but the communities were fascinated about this because it's showing these changes through time in these performances. We also have these offerings of shellfish, maybe these major, large, so pearl shell knives and baler shells. We also excavated in eastern Torres Strait. We found ourselves camping at the place where the new initiates themselves would have camped. Also, that was not incidental, it was very deliberate. We were not initiated, nor were they, come to that. We were taking the same journey that the new initiates would around into the net embayment. And then we shouldn't be very surprised about the fact that we were finding human remains all over the ground. Again, however, we're finding evidence for changes over time. This particular site, mirroring the culture hero trackway, so where it initiates in Western Torres Strait and then finishes off in Eastern Torres Strait, dates much younger. This is where the Wyatt effigy itself would have stood. We dated these. But we also found that the human remains, it was in deposits dating back 300 years, but then there was a hiatus and then more human remains further down. So evidence of multiple, so reinterpretation of a site that had been used for mortuary practices, but then it was being reappropriated for similar but not the same kind of practices. So in conclusion, I think it's clear that Torres Strait ritual specialists developed a complex socio-political and religious system to negotiate the remarkable divisions between these cosmologies on both sides of the Coral Sea. We also see evidence for regional variation across this area. And the Adi and the Gida narratives are excellent ways. They basically personify elements of these movements, but also the innovations that were going on in these different places. They are also really powerful because not only do they show the person within these stories, but they do so in a way that Torres Strait Islanders like. I mean, they can understand this in a way that they can't, this idea of gene flow and these amorphous peoples that are going from one place to the other. And so we can get an idea that is a culturally sensitive idea about movements of people. So we have, as Rod's been talking about, these paleo cultures moving down from Papua New Guinea 7,000 years ago, and Pamanyungan Australians moving up into Torres Strait. But we can look at this based on the culture heroes. We can look at Torres Strait as this incredible nexus of activity. And these weren't passive recipients. They were ritual specialists providing these mortuary rituals back up into New Guinea and down into Cape York as well. And this is something, as Rod has been saying, that is not just confined to what was going on in the past. This continues to this day. So there's syncretism going on in the mortuary ceremonies that we're talking about, the markai, and the tombstone openings that happen in Torres Strait today. And so very quickly, future directions, there is research that could be done, cultural, archaeological, linguistic in these gateway areas, particularly that Boigu region, and also why it's the only culture hero pathway that has been looked at in this way. So there are many other culture heroes that may allow us to unpack history in a way that is going to be very exciting in the future. So thank you very much, and obviously acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Torres Strait, as well as the Ngunnawal, where I'm at the moment.
Thank you very much, Duncan and Rod there.